The candlelight flickers off red velvet. A woman giggles behind a feathered mask. You hear champagne being poured, but not into a glass onto someone's bare chest. You're in Paris, in a private club with no name, where every rule of decency is stripped alongside the corsets. And in the middle of the room, cigar in one hand, mistress on the other, sits the future king of England. His crown hasn't been placed yet, but his throne is already stained. History would call him Edward VII. His friends called him Dirty Bertie. And the stories they didn't want you to hear, the ones about orgies, secret tunnels, and royal prostitutes, nearly tore the monarchy apart. If you believe truth should outlive taboo, subscribe and drop a comment with where you're listening from. Let's pull back the curtain on royalty's dirtiest secret. In the suffocating halls of Buckingham Palace, where every breath was measured and every glance scrutinized, a young prince learned his first lesson in rebellion. Prince Albert Edward, future King Edward VII, discovered that pleasure was not just forbidden, it was the most potent weapon against a mother who ruled her son's life with the iron grip she used to govern an empire. Queen Victoria's court was a cathedral of restraint. Every meal was timed, every conversation monitored, every moment of spontaneity crushed beneath the weight of royal protocol. The boy who would one day be called Dirty Bertie spent his childhood surrounded by tutors who measured his moral temperature like physicians checking for fever. His education was designed not to enlighten, but to suffocate. Latin and Greek, mathematics and moral philosophy, all delivered with the joyless precision of a funeral march. But rebellion, like water, finds its way through the smallest cracks. At 10 years old, Albert Edward stole his first cigarette from a palace guard. The harsh tobacco burned his throat, but the act of defiance burned brighter. He smoked behind tapestries that had witnessed centuries of royal secrets. Each stolen puff a declaration of independence from his mother's suffocating vision of kingship. The nicotine was nothing compared to the intoxicating rush of doing something, anything, that Victoria had not approved, scheduled, or supervised. By 16, the prince had discovered pleasures that would have sent his tutors fleeing to the nearest chapel. In the shadowed corners of aristocratic society, where young lords learned the arts their mothers pretended didn't exist, Albert Edward found his true education. His first sexual encounter, with an actress smuggled into his quarters by sympathetic courtiers, was less about desire than about destruction. Each stolen moment of intimacy was a sledgehammer taken to the pristine image his mother had constructed for him. The palace walls might as well have been made of paper. Victoria's network of spies reported every transgression, every moment of weakness, every sign that her carefully crafted prince was rotting from within. But rather than correction, each discovery seemed to fuel Albert Edward's appetite for more dangerous indulgences. He learned that scandal was not something that happened to him. It was something he could wield like a sword against the throne itself. At 19, when most young men were still finding their footing in the world, Albert Edward had already mastered the art of public disgrace. The Curragh incident, where he was discovered in bed with an Irish actress named Nellie Clifton, sent shockwaves through the royal establishment. But for the prince, it was a moment of crystalline clarity. He had found his power, the ability to horrify his mother and titillate the public in equal measure. Victoria blamed her son for the death of his father, Prince Albert, claiming that the scandal had weakened her husband's constitution and hastened his demise. The accusation might have destroyed a different man, but Albert Edward wore it like a badge of honor. If his pleasure could kill princes and terrify queens, then pleasure would become his religion, his politics, his reason for existing. Every cigar he lit, in defiance of court protocol, every bottle of champagne he drained in flagrant violation of royal temperance, every woman he seduced beneath the disapproving gaze of centuries of royal portraits. All of it was a calculated assault on the very idea of moral monarchy. He was not just rebelling against his mother, he was rebelling against the notion that kings could be anything other than human. The palace physicians warned of moral degeneration, of spiritual corruption that would spread through the bloodline like a hereditary disease. The Archbishop of Canterbury spoke of souls in peril and divine retribution. But Albert Edward had discovered something more intoxicating than any wine, more addictive than any narcotic: the power to shock a world that expected its royalty to be spotless marble statues. In the gaslit salons of London, where gossip traveled faster than royal carriages, whispers followed the prince like shadows. They spoke of appetites that grew more grotesque with each feeding, of desires that no amount of indulgence could satisfy. The boy who had been raised to embody British virtue had become its most spectacular negation, a walking, breathing, fornicating contradiction of everything the monarchy claimed to represent. And this was only the beginning. Paris in the 1880s was a city that understood the art of beautiful corruption. While London suffocated under the weight of Victorian morality, the French capital had perfected the alchemy of transforming sin into sophistication. It was here, in the shadow of the Eiffel Tower's rising steel, that Prince Albert Edward found his true kingdom. Not of subjects, but of sensations. Le Chabanais stood at 12 Rue Chabanais like a temple to earthly delights. From the outside, it appeared unremarkable. Another elegant Parisian townhouse with wrought-iron balconies and cream-colored stone. But those who possessed the right connections, the proper discretion, and sufficient funds knew that beyond its modest facade lay the most elaborate sexual playground in Europe. The prince's first visit had been arranged through intermediaries so discreet they might have been ghosts. French officials, understanding the delicate nature of royal recreation, had ensured that layers of bureaucratic silence and well-compensated blindness would protect his identity. When Albert Edward stepped through the heavy wooden doors of Le Chabanais, he entered a world where his title meant nothing, and his appetite meant everything. You walk through red drapes that part like ceremonial curtains, revealing chambers decorated with an opulence that makes Versailles seem provincial. Persian carpets muffle your footsteps as you move deeper into the labyrinth of pleasure. Crystal chandeliers cast prisms of light across silk wallpaper, hand-painted with scenes from ancient Rome, orgies and bacchanals rendered in gold leaf and shameless detail. Perfume clouds your senses. Jasmine and sandalwood, amber and something darker, more primal, that makes your pulse quicken despite yourself. The prince's favorite retreat was a room on the 3rd floor, accessed by a hidden staircase that allowed him to enter and exit without encountering other patrons. The chamber had been designed to his specifications, a monument to royal excess disguised as interior decoration. At its center sat his most infamous commission, the love chair, a piece of furniture so elaborately engineered for sexual acrobatics that it required an instruction manual. Crafted by the finest Parisian furniture makers, the chair was a mahogany masterpiece of hidden joints and adjustable surfaces. Its design accommodated not just 2 bodies, but 3, sometimes more, in configurations that would have sent medieval theologians shrieking about geometries of damnation. Padded with the finest velvet and equipped with discreet restraints disguised as decorative elements, it was both throne and altar, a place where the future King of England could worship at the shrine of his own limitless hunger. The women who frequented Le Chabanais were not common prostitutes. They were artists of seduction, skilled in the delicate craft of making powerful men feel both utterly dominant and completely vulnerable. Cora Pearl, the English courtesan who had conquered Parisian society, was known to bathe in champagne before her encounters with the prince. La Païva, whose real name was Esther Lachman, possessed a mansion on the Champs-Élysées and a collection of lovers that read like a directory of European nobility. These women understood that Albert Edward was not merely purchasing their bodies. He was buying their silence, their discretion, and most importantly, their ability to make him forget that he was heir to a throne built on moral authority. In their arms, he was not a prince weighted down by duty and expectation. He was simply a man whose appetite had grown too large for any single body to satisfy. The rituals of these encounters followed a choreography as precise as any court ceremony. Champagne would flow like water, not the careful sips of royal banquets, but entire bottles consumed in gulps that left golden streams running down naked skin. Cuban cigars, illegal in England and therefore doubly pleasurable in Paris, filled the air with smoke that mingled with the sounds of silk being torn and inhibitions being discarded. Musicians would play behind screens, their melodies providing soundtrack to acts that would have scandalized the opera. The prince insisted on mirrors, not from vanity, but from a deeper need to watch himself transgressing, to see the future King of England reduced to his most animal essence. Every reflected image was evidence of his successful rebellion against the marble perfection his mother demanded. You don't know where to look in these chambers of orchestrated hedonism. Your eyes drift from gilded ceiling frescoes depicting Greek gods in various states of sexual congress, to the real-life tableau unfolding on divans and daybeds. The boundaries between performance and pleasure, between paid affection and genuine desire, blur until they become meaningless. Here, in this cocoon of silk and sin, truth is measured not in moral absolutes, but in the intensity of sensation. The elite culture that surrounded these gatherings was as intoxicating as the acts themselves. European aristocrats, wealthy merchants, and powerful politicians gathered in Le Chabonaise's drawing rooms to discuss matters of state, while their wives or mistresses prepared for evening entertainments that would have made Roman emperors blush. It was a shadow government of pleasure, where alliances were forged through shared transgression, and secrets became currency more valuable than gold. Masks were not merely decorative, they were essential tools of social survival. Behind elaborate constructions of feathers and jewels, the most recognizable faces in Europe could indulge without fear of identification. The prince himself favored a simple black domino that covered the upper half of his face, though his distinctive beard and corpulent figure made true anonymity impossible. The French had elevated hedonism to high art, creating spaces where pleasure was not simply consumed but curated, orchestrated, and refined until it became a form of aesthetic experience. Le Chabonais was their masterpiece, a place where the raw mechanics of sex were transformed into theater, where physical sensation was elevated to spiritual transcendence through sheer artistic vision. And at the center of it all sat Prince Albert Edward, future King Emperor, lost in a maze of his own making, pursuing satisfactions that grew more elusive with each conquest, surrounded by the echoes of his own inexhaustible hunger, reverberating through chambers that would keep his secrets for a price. What the world failed to understand about Prince Albert Edward's scandalous appetites was that they were not aberrations, they were institutions. Behind the marble facades and moral proclamations of the British establishment lay a machinery of complicity so well oiled that it transformed potential disasters into manageable inconveniences. The palace had not lost control of their wayward prince. They had simply learned to profit from his weaknesses. The network began with Sir Francis Knollys, Edward's private secretary and the most discreet man in England. Knollys possessed the rare gift of selective blindness. He could arrange clandestine meetings, coordinate alibis, and manage delicate communications while maintaining the fiction that he knew nothing about his employer's extracurricular activities. His files, kept in a locked cabinet at Marlborough House, contained enough correspondence to topple governments and destroy dynasties. Yet every letter was catalogued with the meticulous care of a man who understood that information was the most valuable currency in the realm. As long as the scandal stayed whispered, it wasn't a scandal at all. This became the unofficial motto of Edward's inner circle, a philosophy that governed every decision from the guest lists at royal gatherings to the careful choreography of public appearances. The palace had learned that attempting to suppress their prince's nature was like trying to dam the Thames, far better to channel it in directions that served their purposes. The prince's mistresses were not random conquests. They were strategic selections vetted by handlers who understood the delicate balance between pleasure and politics. Alice Keppel, whose beauty was matched only by her intelligence, served as more than Edward's lover. She was his unofficial ambassador to high society, capable of extracting state secrets during pillow talk and delivering royal messages through networks of female influence that operated parallel to official diplomatic channels. Lady Frances Brooke, the Countess of Warwick, brought with her connections to the Liberal Party that proved invaluable during political negotiations. Her husband, the Earl, was not merely tolerant of her arrangement with the prince, he was actively complicit, understanding that his wife's influence in the royal bed translated directly to political advancement and financial opportunity. The cuckoldry was a calculated investment in the family's future prosperity. Agnes Keyser, who operated a private hospital for officers, provided Edward with both intimate companionship and valuable intelligence about military affairs. Through her, the prince learned of regimental morale, officer complaints, and strategic concerns that never appeared in official reports. Her discretion was legendary. She would take state secrets to her grave while ensuring that Edward remained informed about the pulse of his future army. Aristocratic wives were indeed traded like playing cards in these gilded circles, their marriages serving as elaborate covers for more complex arrangements. The Duchess of Manchester, whose husband owed massive gambling debts, found that her liaison with Edward coincided miraculous with the Crown's willingness to overlook certain financial irregularities. As long as the scandal stayed whispered, it wasn't a scandal at all. It was simply business conducted in bedrooms rather than boardrooms. The system operated with clockwork precision. Husbands would conveniently schedule hunting expeditions during their wives' royal visits. Servants would be granted unexpected holidays when discretion was required. House parties would be arranged where certain guests might encounter certain other guests in drawing rooms that locked from the inside. The English aristocracy had perfected the art of orchestrated ignorance. Lady Randolph Churchill, Winston's mother, understood her role in this intricate dance. Her affair with Edward was conducted with such exquisite discretion that it enhanced rather than damaged her social standing. She became a power broker in her own right, hosting salons where political alliances were forged through shared complicity and royal indiscretion. Her drawing room was neutral territory where conservatives and liberals could meet on equal ground, united in their mutual participation in the Crown's elaborate deceptions. The financial arrangements were as carefully managed as the emotional ones. Edward's gambling debts, enormous sums that could bankrupt lesser mortals, were quietly absorbed by wealthy supporters who understood that royal favor was worth more than mere money. His mistresses received gifts that were simultaneously generous and untraceable. Jewelry purchased through intermediaries, property transfers disguised as business investments, trust funds established by anonymous benefactors who happened to benefit from royal patronage. Parliament itself became complicit in the elaborate charade. Members who might otherwise object to royal excess found themselves recipients of honors and appointments that coincidentally followed their discretion regarding certain sensitive matters. The House of Lords contained dozens of peers whose titles had been elevated during moments when their silence was particularly valuable to the Crown. As long as the scandal stayed whispered, it wasn't a scandal at all. The repetition was hypnotic, almost ritualistic, a spell cast to transform transgression into tradition, corruption into custom. The British establishment had discovered that moral authority could be maintained not through actual morality, but through the careful management of public perception. Edward's sins were not hidden so much as transformed, alchemically converted from potential disasters into sources of institutional strength. But transformation, like all magic, has its limits. The summer of 1890 should have been unremarkable in the annals of royal scandal, just another season of carefully managed indiscretion and orchestrated blindness. Instead, it became the moment when the elaborate machinery of palace protection ground against something too large, too public, too grotesque to be contained by the usual methods of aristocratic amnesia. The invitation had arrived on cream-colored paper, sealed with wax that bore no identifying marks. Lord Arthur Somerset, known to his intimates as Podge, was hosting what he described as an evening of continental entertainment at his Belgravia mansion. The guest list read like a directory of European nobility: Russian Grand Dukes, German princes, French counts, and at the center of it all, the unmistakable silhouette of Prince Albert Edward, whose appetite for novelty had grown beyond what even Le Chabonnais could satisfy. Somerset's parties were legendary among those privileged enough to receive invitations. He had studied the orgies of Rome and the symposiums of ancient Greece, applying scholarly precision to the architecture of pleasure. His mansion had been retrofitted with hidden passages, soundproof chambers, and discreet entrances that allowed guests to arrive and depart without detection. What happened within those walls was protected by more than mere discretion. It was shielded by a conspiracy of mutual destruction, where every participant held secrets that could annihilate every other participant. The evening began with the familiar rituals of elite debauchery. Champagne flowed like water while servants, chosen for their youth and their poverty, moved through rooms thick with cigar smoke and heavier appetites. The prince, resplendent in a silk robe that barely contained his corpulent frame, held court from a throne-like chair that had been specially reinforced to accommodate both his weight and his activities. One moment, velvet laughter echoed through chambers decorated with mirrors and mythology. The next, the sound of a chambermaid crying outside the door cut through the manufactured ecstasy like a blade through silk. Lady Margaret Thornfield, 19 years old and newly married to a baronet twice her age, had locked herself in a water closet, her evening gown torn, her carefully arranged hair now a tangle of pins and desperation. The details that survived, fragments preserved in burned letters, whispered confessions, and the fevered writings of those who could not forget what they had witnessed, painted a picture of systematic degradation, orchestrated for the amusement of men who confused power with pleasure. Servants were not merely staff but participants, their consent purchased with threats of unemployment and promises of gold. Aristocratic wives found themselves swept into activities that transformed them from observers to exhibits, their dignity sacrificed on altars built from their husbands' political ambitions. Prince Edward had not merely attended, he had presided. Witnesses described him moving through the rooms like a Roman emperor reviewing his domains, selecting partners with the casual authority of a man choosing dinner courses. His participation was not passive but directorial, orchestrating tableaux of flesh and power that satisfied not just his physical appetites but his deeper hunger for absolute dominion over other human beings. But secrets, like gases, expand to fill available space. Within days, whispers began circulating through London's servant networks, that parallel universe of gossip and grievance that moved through backstairs and kitchen doorways with relentless efficiency. A footman had seen too much. A lady's maid had heard too much. A coachman had driven away from Somerset's mansion with passengers whose tears had left stains on the carriage cushions. The crisis reached Marlborough House through channels so discreet they might have been telepathic. Sir Francis Knollys received reports that made his usually impassive face turn the color of ash. Newspaper editors were asking questions. Parliamentary members were making inquiries. Most terrifying of all, Scotland Yard was rumoured to be opening an investigation into activities contrary to public decency, at addresses that remained unnamed but were all too easily identified. The royal family's response was swift and comprehensive. The Archbishop of Canterbury was summoned for private consultations that officially never occurred. The Lord Chancellor reviewed certain legal precedents regarding prosecution of persons of royal blood. The Prime Minister received briefings about matters of national security that required the most delicate handling. Press magnates were invited to private dinners, where the conversation never explicitly mentioned recent events but somehow conveyed the understanding that certain stories would be detrimental to British interests abroad. Editors discovered that their newspapers' government contracts were subject to periodic review. Reporters found themselves reassigned to cover agricultural shows in Scotland when their investigations grew too persistent. The legal system bent like grass in a hurricane. Evidence disappeared from police files. Witnesses received unexpected offers of employment in distant colonies. Court records were sealed for reasons of national security, a classification that could extend indefinitely. The entire apparatus of British justice revealed itself to be as malleable as warm clay when shaped by sufficient pressure from sufficiently powerful hands. Religious authorities provided the final layer of protection. Sermons were preached about the dangers of gossip and the Christian duty of forgiveness. The doctrine of royal divine appointment was emphasized with renewed vigor. To question the moral authority of the crown was to question God's own judgment in selecting his earthly representatives. The monarchy had not merely survived a scandal, it had absorbed it, digested it, and transformed it into something that strengthened rather than weakened the institution. The very grotesqueness of what had occurred became a weapon. Who would believe such monstrous accusations against the respectable facade of royal propriety? But the price of this protection was written in invisible ink across the soul of the institution itself, a debt that would compound with interest through generations yet unborn. In the aftermath of scandal, when the velvet curtains had fallen and the champagne had turned flat in abandoned glasses, another kind of machinery awakened, one far more sophisticated than any pleasure device Edward had ever commissioned. The royal cleanup crew operated with the precision of surgeons and the ruthlessness of executioners, their mission not to heal but to erase, not to preserve truth but to manufacture a more palatable fiction. The operation began in the basement archives of Marlborough House, where Sir Francis Knollys supervised the systematic destruction of evidence with the methodical care of a master librarian cataloguing acquisitions. Letters that detailed intimate arrangements disappeared into roaring fires, their ashes scattered across London's Thames like grey snow. Diaries that chronicled forbidden encounters were reduced to memory. Then even memory was negotiated away through carefully applied pressure and precisely calculated bribes. History was his laundress, and every stain was treated with gold. Lady Somerset's correspondence, dozens of letters that detailed her observations of the prince's activities, vanished from her personal safe during a burglary that took nothing else of value. The lock remained intact, the jewels untouched, but the papers that could have destroyed dynasties simply ceased to exist. When questioned, Lady Somerset developed a peculiar form of selective amnesia, remembering dinner menus with perfect clarity, while forgetting entirely any social gatherings that might have involved royal personages in compromising positions. The press machinery ground into motion with industrial efficiency. Lord Northcliffe, who controlled the Daily Mail and commanded influence across Britain's newspaper empire, received private audiences at Windsor Castle, where conversations about editorial responsibility and national interest took place in rooms where no stenographers were present. These discussions were never recorded, yet somehow their effects rippled through newsrooms across the kingdom. Editors discovered that stories critical of royal behavior encountered mysterious technical difficulties. Printing presses broke down at crucial moments. Distribution networks experienced unexpected delays. Advertising revenue from government contracts became subject to periodic review based on editorial choices that demonstrated proper patriotic sensibility. The message was never stated explicitly, yet it was received with crystalline clarity. The Crown's reputation was a matter of national security, and national security trumped journalistic curiosity. Meanwhile, the pageantry machine manufactured spectacle with breathtaking audacity. Royal portraits were commissioned showing Edward in magnificent regalia, his corpulent frame draped in ceremonial robes that transformed physical excess into imperial dignity. These images were reproduced in newspapers, displayed in public buildings, and distributed throughout the empire. Visual propaganda that replaced the reality of a debauched prince with the fiction of a noble heir. Public appearances were choreographed with theatrical precision. Edward would emerge from gilded carriages, resplendent in military uniforms decorated with medals that spoke of duty and honor rather than indulgence and appetite. The crowds that gathered to see him witnessed carefully constructed moments of royal dignity. The prince, inspecting troops with apparent gravitas, blessing children with practiced benevolence, attending church services with manufactured piety. But behind the public curtain, the real Edward continued his performances for smaller, more select audiences. In private drawing rooms scattered across London's most fashionable districts, he still held court from velvet chairs, still orchestrated entertainments that would have scandalized the same crowds who cheered his public appearances. The cleanup crew had not reformed the prince. They had simply learned to manage the contradiction between his public image and private reality. The testimonies that survived were those that served the crown's purposes. Servants who had witnessed uncomfortable truths found themselves recipients of generous settlements that came with lifetime vows of silence. Those who proved less amenable to financial persuasion encountered different forms of pressure: sudden unemployment, eviction from tied housing, or mysterious difficulties in finding new positions. The servant network that had once threatened to expose royal secrets became a conspiracy of enforced silence, purchased through a combination of gold and terror. Names were not merely silenced. They were surgically removed from the historical record. Guest lists were rewritten. Social registers were edited. Even parish records underwent subtle alterations when they contained evidence of relationships that might prove embarrassing to retrospective examination. The cleanup crew understood that controlling the past was as important as managing the present. History was his laundress, and every stain was treated with gold. The analogy was more than poetic. It was literally accurate. Enormous sums flowed from royal coffers to ensure that Edward's indiscretions left no permanent marks on the historical fabric. Blackmail payments were disguised as charitable donations. Hush money was classified as royal gifts. The monarchy had discovered that reputation could be purchased like any other commodity, provided one possessed sufficient resources and sufficient ruthlessness. The Church of England provided spiritual dry cleaning for sins that seemed too large for ordinary forgiveness. Special services were conducted asking for divine guidance in matters of royal discretion. The Archbishop of Canterbury developed a theology of selective blindness, preaching that earthly monarchs, like biblical kings, might occasionally fall prey to human weakness while remaining divinely appointed. Private communion services cleansed royal souls with the same efficiency that royal gold cleansed public records. Foreign governments were enlisted in the cleanup operation through diplomatic channels that operated beneath official recognition. French authorities agreed to seal certain police records. German cousins promised discretion regarding family gatherings that had grown too festive. The European royal network, bound together by blood and mutual vulnerability, created an international conspiracy of silence that protected all by protecting each. The most ingenious aspect of the cleanup operation was its transformation of potential scandal into actual strength. Each successfully suppressed story became evidence of the monarchy's power and reach. Critics who attempted to expose royal behavior discovered that their accusations disappeared into a void of official denial and coordinated silence. The very thoroughness of the cover-up became a demonstration of institutional authority that was perhaps more impressive than moral behavior would have been. Public portraits continued to be painted and displayed, showing Edward in poses of dignity and restraint, while somewhere in a private chamber, the real prince continued to smoke cigars in his velvet chair, surrounded by the echoes of pleasures that officially had never occurred. The cleanup crew had achieved something remarkable. They had created a parallel universe where the same person could simultaneously exist as both royal saint and imperial sinner, depending entirely on which version of reality the observer was permitted to see. The true price of Prince Edward's appetites could not be measured in gold or calculated in parliamentary debates. It was written in the growing chasm between what the British people believed about their monarchy and what their monarchy had actually become. A gap that widened with each successful cover-up, each purchased silence, each triumph of pageantry over truth. In the drawing rooms of middle-class Britain, where families gathered around gas lamps to read newspapers that had been carefully scrubbed of uncomfortable truths, a subtle poison was spreading. The working classes, who had been taught to revere royal virtue as compensation for their own hardships, began to sense that something fundamental had shifted in the cosmic order. They could not articulate what they felt, but they felt it nonetheless. The growing awareness that their betters were not, in fact, better. He didn't wear the crown, he wore its shadow. The phrase captured something essential about Edward's relationship to royal authority. True kingship required the sublimation of personal desire to public duty, the transformation of individual will into national symbol. But Edward had inverted this ancient alchemy, using the power of kingship to amplify his personal appetites, rather than transcending them. He did not rule, he performed royalty, treating the crown as a costume that could be put on for public appearances and discarded when more interesting entertainments beckoned. Queen Victoria, ensconced in her perpetual mourning at Windsor Castle, understood the corrosion better than anyone. Each report of her son's behavior landed on her desk like a death certificate for the institution she had spent decades perfecting. The woman who had transformed the British monarchy from a political force into a moral authority watched helplessly as her heir systematically destroyed everything she had built. The conversations between mother and son took place in reception rooms where centuries of royal portraits observed their dysfunction with painted eyes. Victoria's accusations were precise and devastating. Edward had not merely dishonored himself, but had corrupted the very idea of monarchy. His father, Prince Albert, had died from the shame of his son's early scandals, or so Victoria believed, and so she reminded Edward with every encounter. The prince's response was to light another cigar and arrange another party, as if pleasure could somehow compensate for maternal condemnation. The international implications spread like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. Republican movements across Europe seized upon whispered stories of British royal excess, as evidence that monarchy itself was a diseased institution. In France, where memories of their own revolution remained fresh, politicians pointed across the channel as proof that kings were merely corrupt men wearing expensive costumes. German intellectuals, inheriting traditions of philosophical skepticism, developed elaborate theories about the inevitable decadence of hereditary power. British Republicans, a minority but a vocal one, found their arguments sharpened by each successfully suppressed scandal. They could not prove what Edward had done, but they could point to the very thoroughness of the cover-up as evidence of something that required covering. The monarchy's greatest strength, its ability to control information, became a weapon in the hands of its critics. who argued that such comprehensive secrecy could only conceal comprehensive corruption. The working classes, who bore the economic burden of royal excess through their taxes, began to ask uncomfortable questions about the relationship between their sacrifices and their sovereign's pleasures. Trade unions, growing stronger and more politically sophisticated, started calculating the cost of royal entertainments in terms of workers' wages, royal estates in terms of public housing that could have been built. Edward's indulgences were not merely personal failings, they were becoming political vulnerabilities that threatened the entire system of hereditary privilege. He didn't wear the crown, he wore its shadow. The metaphor extended beyond Edward himself to encompass the entire institution he represented. The British monarchy had become a shadow of its former moral authority, maintaining the forms of dignity while abandoning their substance. Public ceremonies continued with magnificent pageantry, but they felt increasingly hollow, like theatrical performances that had lost connection to their original meaning. The psychological toll on Edward himself was evident to those who knew him intimately. Sir Francis Knollys observed that the prince had developed a peculiar form of royal schizophrenia, seamlessly transitioning between his public persona of dignified restraint and his private reality of boundless appetite. The strain of maintaining this double existence manifested in physical symptoms: insomnia, digestive problems, and a tremor in his hands that became noticeable during public appearances. Victoria's relationship with her son deteriorated into a kind of Cold War, conducted through intermediaries and official protocols. Mother and heir could no longer bear to be alone in the same room, their conversations mediated by private secretaries who translated royal displeasure into diplomatic language. The woman who had given her name to an age of moral certainty found herself presiding over the dissolution of the very values she had supposedly embodied. The empire itself began to reflect the corruption at its center. Colonial administrators, understanding that moral authority no longer flowed from the crown with its previous clarity, became more brazen in their own excesses. Military officers, knowing that royal favor could excuse almost any transgression, pushed the boundaries of acceptable behavior in distant territories, where news traveled slowly and supervision was minimal. The clergy faced an impossible theological challenge: how to preach divine right monarchy when the monarch in waiting embodied divine wrong. Sunday sermons became exercises in creative interpretation, emphasizing the institution over the individual, the crown over the head that wore it. But congregations were not stupid, and the contradiction between pulpit and palace became another source of cynicism that eroded faith in both religious and secular authority. Perhaps most tragically, Edward's behavior poisoned the well of genuine reform and progress. His support for certain liberal causes became a liability rather than an asset, as his association tainted even worthy initiatives with suspicions of ulterior motive. Social reformers found themselves distancing their movements from royal patronage, understanding that Edward's blessing might prove more damaging than his opposition. The prince had not merely failed to fulfill his role as future king, he had demonstrated that the role itself might be impossible to fulfill in the modern world. The ancient covenant between ruler and ruled depended on the fiction that hereditary privilege produced superior character. Edward's life was a sustained argument against that fiction, a living proof that power corrupted not just occasionally but inevitably. He didn't wear the crown, he wore its shadow, and that shadow grew longer with each passing year, stretching across an empire that was beginning to question whether the light that cast it was worth preserving. When Edward VII finally ascended the throne in 1901, at the age of 59, he brought with him a body that had become a monument to excess. 4 decades of indulgence had transformed the once handsome prince into a grotesque caricature of royal appetite. A man so corpulent that special reinforcements were required for his coronation throne, so breathless from years of cigars and rich living that climbing a single flight of stairs left him gasping like a landed fish. His physicians, sworn to discretion more binding than their Hippocratic oath, documented a catalogue of afflictions that read like a medical textbook of self-destruction. Chronic bronchitis from endless Cuban cigars, gout from champagne dinners that lasted until dawn, a heart so strained by obesity and stimulation that it struggled to pump blood through arteries clogged with the residue of a lifetime's pleasures. The body that had once been the instrument of his rebellion had become the prison of his mortality. Yet even as king, Edward could not abandon the appetites that had defined him. His coronation banquet featured 14 courses and lasted 5 hours, a final performance of excess disguised as ceremony. The newly crowned monarch required assistance to rise from his chair. His breathing labored, his face flushed purple from the effort of existing within flesh that had grown too heavy for his failing frame. The 9 years of his actual reign were marked by a peculiar form of kinetic dying, a gradual shutdown of bodily systems that occurred in parallel with increasingly frantic attempts to maintain his legendary lifestyle. State dinners became endurance tests, where the king would dose himself with stimulants to remain conscious through the endless toasts and diplomatic pleasantries. Royal tours were punctuated by medical emergencies, disguised as brief indispositions that required immediate but undisclosed treatment. His final years unfolded in rooms that had been transformed into medical theaters, though the props remained those of pleasure rather than healing. The famous love chair from Le Chabanais, transported to his private apartments at Buckingham Palace, now served primarily as an oversized medical device, its elaborate mechanisms repurposed to help position a body too damaged to support itself. The prince who had once orchestrated orgies now required assistance to change his clothes. When death finally claimed him in May 1910, it came not with the dramatic flair of his life, but with the quiet systemic failure of organs, exhausted by decades of abuse. His last words, according to his physician, were about a horse race. He wanted to attend a final gesture toward the pleasures that had consumed him, even as his body surrendered to their accumulated cost. The transformation of Edward's legacy began before his corpse had grown cold. The same machinery that had spent decades concealing his scandals now worked to manufacture his posthumous reputation. History was revised with surgical precision. The debauched prince became the diplomatic king, his network of international mistresses rebranded as evidence of his continental sophistication and political acumen. The official biographies, commissioned and carefully supervised by palace authorities, painted a portrait of a monarch who had used his years as heir apparent to develop an unparalleled understanding of European politics and society. His frequent visits to foreign capitals, previously understood as pleasure tours, were reinterpreted as informal diplomatic missions that had strengthened Britain's international relationships through personal charm rather than formal negotiation. The man who nearly drowned the monarchy in champagne was buried in gold leaf. The phrase captured both the literal extravagance of his funeral and the metaphorical transformation of his legacy. Westminster Abbey had never witnessed such elaborate ceremonial excess. A coffin made from solid oak and lined with lead. A golden crown that weighed more than some men could lift. A procession that stretched for miles through London streets, lined with mourners who genuinely believed they were witnessing the burial of a beloved king. Foreign royalty attended in unprecedented numbers, their presence interpreted as tribute to Edward's diplomatic genius, rather than acknowledgement of shared secrets too dangerous to leave unwitnessed. Kaiser Wilhelm II, King Alfonso XIII, and dozens of other European monarchs followed the funeral cortege in a display of international mourning that the press celebrated as evidence of Edward's unprecedented success in fostering continental harmony. The royal cleanup crew had achieved their masterpiece, the complete transformation of historical reality through the simple expedient of controlling who was allowed to remember what and how they were permitted to remember it. You thought kings were chosen by God. Turns out they're chosen by scandal, protected not by virtue, but by velvet curtains and loyal editors. Edward VII's story is not really about one man's appetites. It's about the machinery that enables them, the systems that profit from them, and the institutions that survive by transforming them into something else entirely. His legacy lives not in the official histories that celebrate his diplomatic achievements, but in the precedent he established, that monarchy could survive anything, provided it possessed sufficient resources to purchase silence and sufficient power to manufacture alternative truths. The real revelation of Edward's reign was not that kings could be corrupt that had been known since the first crown was forged from stolen gold. The revelation was that corruption itself could become a source of institutional strength that the very act of successfully concealing scandals demonstrated a level of control over society that moral authority could never achieve. You thought royal power came from divine appointment, hereditary right, or popular consent. But Edward showed us what it really flows from: the ability to make inconvenient truths disappear, to transform witnesses into accomplices, to convert potential enemies into purchased friends. His orgies were not aberrations from royal duty. They were exercises in it, demonstrations of the ultimate privilege that comes with ultimate power. The velvet curtains that shielded his private performances were not just decorative choices. They were symbols of the fundamental barrier between public myth and private reality that defines all monarchical systems. Behind those curtains, the future king-emperor revealed himself as neither divine nor appointed, but simply human in the most degraded sense possible. Yet the curtains held, maintained by armies of servants, editors, politicians, and clergymen who understood that their own positions depended on preserving the fiction that what happened behind them was either virtuous or non-existent. He didn't destroy the monarchy, but he showed us what it's really made of. Not marble and gold, not divine right and noble blood, but something far more durable and far more disturbing: the complicity of entire societies in maintaining beautiful lies. Edward's subjects were not merely ruled by him. They were co-conspirators in his deceptions, participants in a grand theatrical production where everyone agreed to pretend that the emperor's clothes were magnificent, even when he wore nothing but his own appetites. The love chair that sits in a museum today, gathering dust behind protective glass, is not a curiosity from a more debauched age. It is a monument to the enduring truth that power is not about the ability to command obedience, but about the capacity to transform transgression into tradition, scandal into ceremony, vice into virtue, and to convince entire nations to applaud the transformation. In the end, Edward VII accomplished something more lasting than any military victory or diplomatic triumph. He proved that monarchy could survive its own complete moral bankruptcy, provided it possessed sufficient skill in managing the distance between what people were allowed to see and what actually existed. The champagne may have stopped flowing, the orgies may have ended, but the machinery he helped perfect continues to operate, ensuring that the next scandal, and the next, and the next, will be absorbed, processed, and transformed into something else entirely. The king is dead. Long live the system that made him possible.